I call the November 6th Assembly Finance Committee meeting to order. Ms. Wendell, will you note the roll?
Thank you, Chair Train. We have all Assembly members present in chambers besides Mayor Weldon, who is absent.
Thank you. That brings us to approval of minutes. You have the September 18th Assembly Finance Committee meeting minutes. Any suggested changes to those minutes? Seeing none, those are so approved, which brings us to agenda topics. Before we jump in, I just wanted to let committee members know, some of you may remember at our last regular assembly meeting, we passed on a ordinance from the hospital for a hospital appropriation to this committee for their emergency room work. After talking to staff, and it sounds like the hospital is still a few months away from getting a certificate of need from the state that they would need to move forward with the project. So we decided to wait. We decided to wait until we had more information on that, and recognizing that there wasn't urgency on that item any longer. So just wanted to make that clear to folks. All right. So that's going to bring us to Gastineau Human Services. Staff, any introduction to this, or should I just invite GHS folks? Go ahead. Oh, Mr. Swinton, and anyone else you want to come up, you can go ahead and position yourself in front of those microphones. Thank you all for being here. If you could just introduce yourself, and then we've got a memo here, but anything you want to tell us and context would be appreciated.
I'm Ryan Kozlerich. I'm the Finance and Admin Director at Gastineau Human Services. And I don't know if we just adjourned.
Jonathan Swinton. I'm the Executive Director with Gastineau Human Services.
Fred Sweetsky, Behavioral Health Director with Gastineau Human Services.
One thing I want to, I guess, start with is since we were here last, we have added the 8 additional beds to our treatment program. Very grateful. A few of the assembly members, Representative Kelly and Adkisson, came to an open house that we had, and we're very grateful for that. We're able to show them those facilities. So we are operating with 27 beds now, which we're very excited about, and appreciate your willingness to consider some funding to support that expansion. What questions do you have?
Questions from the committee? Mr. Smith.
Madam Chair, thank you for being here and for your work to stand this up and to expand it. I guess my question is just, you noted in the memo the estimated capital costs. I was just kind of curious about revenue related to this program, or maybe a better example would be, the beds you had existing, I think, for the past year. I'm just curious, like, is the program generating revenue or covering costs? And, I'm just trying to, or is it also like covering the capital costs that it took to develop the program, build out the program, I should say. Thank you.
Yeah, so our current program, we had 19 beds before we added the other 8 beds. And we've been receiving revenue from Medicaid mostly for those 19 beds over the last year. The Medicaid billing rate doesn't cover our operation. So it doesn't even cover our personnel. It covers a chunk of it, but we also have about $620,000 of grant revenue that helps us break even. That grant revenue comes from a CBHTR grant it comes from Juneau Community Foundation, and it comes from the HAP grant. So Juneau Community Foundation has given us as much as they can give us. The CBHTR grant, we'll have to reapply for those funds when we can. And then the HAP funds, that's going to be a static amount that we're getting for the next few years. That's not going to be up for renewal for a while. So that's kind of a static amount. Adding the additional 8 beds, it adds additional cost. The revenue that we bring in with that cost is not going to be fully offset. We still have costs we need to cover. And outside of what's on this sheet here, Department of Corrections has also decided they're renegotiating our contract for our CRC program. That CRC program supplies the security staff we need to run this program. That's $1.2 million for our security staff. So if they cut that program, we also now have to find a way to fund our security staff. So the ask from the Assembly of the 500,000, that's not nearly as much as it could cost to run this program. That is what we think is reasonable, given the fact that it is going to take a little time for us to fill these beds, to start billing revenue, and to start receiving revenue. Just because we have a bed filled doesn't mean we have revenue. We have to bill for it, we have to receive it. So there's a delay in time for us to be able to cover our costs. There's upfront costs in capital, and there's personal services that aren't covered by Medicaid once we do receive those funds.
And I'd add, we have had to make some adjustments on some facilities. We have, for example, a number of people office sharing in situations that aren't ideal, where some of the capital expenses that are listed here, we're hoping to do some minor remodels of a few office spaces to make it a better long-term solution with the additional 8 beds.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you. So we've heard a recurring theme. Rainforest Recovery didn't get enough Medicaid reimbursement to provide substance abuse treatment. You guys are saying that the Medicaid reimbursement rate does not cover live-in substance abuse treatment. What are other organizations and facilities doing if the main payer for substance abuse treatment does not cover the cost of what it costs to provide this level of treatment? This cannot be a unique Juneau thing. What do the organizations do to, I know you just mentioned grants, but the whole nation's problem can't be, well, Medicaid just isn't paying us, so we don't do it. How do we move forward so that there's enough money?
So one of the ways we move forward is we get the state to increase the reimbursement rate for Medicaid. That's number one. That's definitely needed. One of the differences between Rainforest and our program is that the services they were providing were 3.5 and we're providing 3.1. So the 3.5 program requires a lot more expenses to operate than a 3.1 does. So even though we're not fully covering our operations with Medicaid revenue, we're covering a lot more of them than Rainforest could.
And to speak to what other programs are doing, I mean, to be frank, they're closing. We've had the closure of Rainforest here, just in Southeast alone. Ketchikan's lost 2 residential treatment programs this last year. We did a research, call around, just in updating our referral partners, and found that 10 2.1 programs in the state have closed within the last 3 years, with at least 2 closing within the last 4 months. Some of that is due to lack of funding, some of that is due to lack of staff. What treatment programs have done in the state and have always done is get creative in how they pursue grants. They get creative in the way that they cover costs. A lot of them are operating, these are passionate people that do the work they do because they care about it, but they're doing it for way less money than they could make in the private sector. And it's getting harder and harder to hold on to staff. And yeah, it is a difficulty with the reimbursement rate. And it's a mix of grant funding, donations, If you're fortunate, maybe you have an angel investor or two that's willing to donate you some money. Like it is a really difficult thing to do, to try and diversify the funding sources to find some stability, because Medicaid is not covering the cost of operations.
And one other thing just to add, one thing we have going for us that some of the programs that have closed don't is we are a nonprofit organization. We're not trying to, build mansions on hills as a result of doing this. We're just trying to break even. And we have a very robust team that works on alternative sources of funding. And so that's how we've been able to get through this. And we're very hopeful that we'll continue to get through this. I mean, one of the reasons we're here is because we're pulling out the stops everywhere we can to try to make sure this program can last long term.
Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to follow up about the, I guess, corrections, not DOJ. The corrections coming up for renegotiation. Was that unexpected, and do you expect that program to be cut?
It was definitely unexpected. We are on a 5-year cycle, which renewed last December. So we went through the whole RFP process, which was a very arduous process for their requirements for this. When you're dealing with corrections, there are 25 layers of red tape that we have to make sure we're covering because we're dealing with a protected population. We have had contracts with them for a long time. We are the only halfway house program in Southeast Alaska. And 6 years ago, when we hit a renewal, the DOC made major cuts to our program. We went from servicing 85 people to 40 beds. They cut us back to. And the rates they were paying us as part of those cuts were unsustainable. It led to a 5-year trajectory decline in that program that led to ultimate losses as an agency for 2 years until we renegotiated the contract and told them this is what it actually costs to do this. And they signed it. They awarded us the contract, said the plan is to do this for 5 years. And last month they called us up and say they want to renegotiate those rates down because they think they're giving us too much money. And so we're in the thick of trying to deal with that. We're in a fairly powerless situation because they ultimately hold the power in this dynamic. And like I said, we have a robust team who's pulling out all the stops we can think of to try to help with this. But ultimately, we do expect that that program is going to see a significant hit in funding, which is going to require us to do some real consideration on the long-term viability of continuing with the Department of Corrections.
And just to make sure I heard, you said 10 3.1 programs had closed? Sorry.
10 2.1 program.
2.1. Thanks.
Which is intensive outpatient treatment.
Great.
Any last questions from the committee? Mr. Smith, do you have a motion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move ordinance 2024-01 BP to the Assembly, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objections? Seeing none, that is so moved. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We really appreciate it, and for all the work that you're doing. All right, that brings us to the next item, which is sales tax code revisions. Ms. Flick.
Thank you, Chair Wall. This starts on page 13 of your packet. There are 2 ordinances here for your consideration. One I noted as being housekeeping, and I realize that that is 29 pages of housekeeping, but really the remote sellers tax group has worked really hard to refine the remote sellers sales tax. They collect about $4.5 million for us every year. And the first ordinance, 2024-36, aligns our code with those changes that were made by the commission. We had both staff from Treasury and staff from Law participate in that refinement of that code. So I don't think there's any big surprises in there. There's some nuances in terminology. I know that's a little bit strange, but that one is really fairly straightforward. Draft ordinance 2024 number 37 is, it seeks to accomplish two things. We are always trying to provide clarification both for merchants and for staff with our code. We want the code to be broad enough that it can be longstanding, but sometimes definitions become super helpful. And so there's the addition of several definitions with this ordinance that will just help provide clarification on some of the areas where we see merchants struggling, where it is hard for staff to point to code and say, no, this is what this really means. And so those are added to this particular ordinance. The other thing that's really, I'm going to call exciting, if there's an exciting part of sales tax code, is an introduction of a concept of itinerant business. And you may remember, my goodness, I think it was 2 falls ago, you adopted a small business provision within the sales tax code that says something along the lines of if you only make X dollars, fairly small dollars, over the course of an entire year, you can be an annual filer, so you're not having to do quarterly filings. And that was a big help for small businesses in the community. What we're looking to do with the itinerant business is really try to help those who come to town once a year for an event. So think the public market, think the recent Tattoo and Ink Expo. You have somebody come to town, they are selling goods or services, they should be collecting and remitting that sales tax. Currently, they're required to set up a regular sales tax account that requires regular care and feeding every reporting cycle, whether they come back to Juneau or not. So the itinerant business allows them to set up basically a temporary sales tax ID, be here for their event, report and remit their sales tax before they leave town, and then not have to worry about maintaining an account with the sales tax. There are some communities that have a program very similar to this. We gained information and leveraged the policies and practices that they had. Those are the big things. I do have Nikki here from Law, and I have Ruth, our treasurer here, who have been deep in the weeds of both of these ordinances. So happy to take questions and happy to call the experts if we need to.
Thank you. Any questions on these revisions? Mr. Bryson.
Thank you for being here tonight, Ms. Flick. I really appreciate you're calling it, say the phrase again for the short-term business?
Itinerant.
Itinerant business. Do we know how many businesses that have filed now would qualify for that, or how many people have got in trouble because they didn't do like the next return or the notification that they weren't in Juneau anymore? How big of a situation is this?
Mr. Bryson, it is really hard to identify exactly how many we're missing and how many people are having to keep up with this. We know there is a population out there that comes to town once a year for an event. Some of them register and do what they're supposed to do, some don't. So it is hard to tell right now how many. I believe we have about 500 registered merchants who aren't actively filing. Some of that population is likely itinerant businesses under this new definition, but it's hard to say exactly how many we have.
Any other questions? Mr. Steininger.
Just kind of generally, when an event like, you mentioned the, public market or the Tattoo Expo happens, do we do outreach to the organizers of that event to ensure that the vendors coming to the event are informed of our sales tax rules and to inform them of the, of this new itinerant rule should it pass?
Great question. We currently do work both with the organizers, and we do outreach to, as much as we can, to the vendors that are participating. Certainly, if this passes, that will change the brand of our outreach, because we'll do some education. We'll probably convert some folks over who have regular sales tax type accounts. But absolutely, we do try to reach out both to the organizers, to the facilities that host those kinds of events, just to ensure that we've got that fair playing field with all merchants in town.
Mr. Smith, do you have a motion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll do these maybe one at a time. I would move ordinance 2024-36. I would move the Assembly introduce and set for public hearing ordinance 2024-36, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objections? I see Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I had spoken to the attorney about a possible need for a correction to the effective date. If this motion passes, would it be introduced with that revision?
With the chair, I will call up my expert.
Absolutely. Mr. Kelly, will you, for those of us just hearing of this, would you clarify just a little bit your question?
Sure. I think it was the original intent to introduce this and having it go into effect. It says the effective date is January 1st, but if we introduce this in November and then we hear it and pass it in December, January 1st would be less than the normal 30 days for an ordinance to take effect. Right now, as the ordinance reads as drafted, it would say there would be a conflict.
I'm sorry, I forget your last name, but go ahead.
Nicole Lynch. Through the chair. So since our code requires 30 days notice, there's no actual need to change the language. It would automatically, within 30 days after, if it passes, then it would go into effect then.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, and I remove my objection.
Any other objections? Seeing none, that is so moved. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that I move to introduce and set for public hearing draft ordinance 2024-37, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objections? Seeing none, that is so moved. That brings us to bond refundings. Ms. Flick.
Thank you, Chair Wool. This concept and draft ordinance is being brought to you. It's called a bond refunding. I would just in your mind, it's a bond refinancing. It flows better in your mind, but the correct word in the legal realm is refunding. And working with our municipal advisors, we have identified a handful of issuances. So if you remember, when we issue a big bond, it's actually made up of a bunch of little bonds within it. So there are a handful of those that are eligible to be called in and refinanced. The original bonds were issued through the Municipal Bond Bank. And so they are preparing to do an issuance in January, February, March kind of timeframe. And we have an opportunity to refinance a handful of these issues in the 3 different series. It will result over the life of these bonds a savings of about $700,000. On the beautiful side, it doesn't require a lot from us to make that happen, since the bond bank is already in their process. And in order to make it happen, however, an ordinance needs to be approved by the Assembly saying we want this to happen, and then close to the time that the actual issuance occurs, you will see likely 3 resolutions, one for each of the series, addressing interest rate and other specific details. And so this is being brought to you for action to send to the Assembly for introduction and public hearing if you would like to pursue the refinancing.
Questions from the committee? Mr. Bryson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Flick, you said 700,000 over the lifetime of this. How long is that time period to achieve that $700,000 in savings?
That is a fantastic question. I believe we have about 10 to 12 years left on these issuances. So it'll be just over the course of that a little bit each year.
Excellent, thank you.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I see these were revenue bonds that utilized marine passenger fees. Is that the fund that will see the savings?
That is correct.
Very good.
So every year we do a transfer from the marine passenger fees over to the debt service fund for this. With the lower interest rates, that transfer becomes just a little bit less.
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Smith, do you have a motion?
Yep, thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we introduce and set for public hearing the attached draft ordinance authorizing refunding of 2014 and 2015 revenue bond issuances, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objections? Seeing none, that is so moved. That brings us to, we have 2 more items tonight. They're under information only, just because we don't have action that are required tonight, but we wanted to put this in front of you in case there's any questions. So the first is the Assembly grant process. Ms. Flick, do you want to introduce this?
Absolutely. So this is on page 58 of your packet. There are a couple things we wanted to bring back to you in preparation for our upcoming budget season. As many of you will recall, when we approached the Assembly Community Grant process, we identified a certain number of agencies that the Assembly regularly grants funds to, and we call those partner agencies. Through our process, we had omitted the the Small Business Development Group as a partner agency. And so we just wanted to officially say out loud that our intent is to include them as a partner agency in this coming cycle. The other thing, through the feedback, kind of debriefing out of the budget process, you all experimented with a new process last year of community organizations reaching out to you, finding an Assembly sponsor to bring forward their grant request to the AFC for consideration. And along with that, there was a request for better information that we could hand to an organization to say, here's the process, here's what to expect, here's what's going to happen. And then there was also a request to perhaps involve staff a little bit more so that we made sure that items that were being provided ended up in the packet at the right time and grouped together. So if I can direct your attention to page 59, our amazing budget staff have come up with 2 different versions of a flow chart that, that speak to the process. And so the first one on page 59 is for the partner agencies. And essentially it identifies that they do a funding, that they submit their funding request to CBJ staff in December. And assuming that it's status quo, it falls into the proposed manager's budget. There's a memorandum of agreement, the award disbursement, and then the program updates. Most of our partner agencies are aware of this. They flow through that pretty easily. On the next page, on page 60 though, is designed for community organizations. And so this is where we have added a couple of boxes, but wanted to just, kind of put it out there that they need to find an assembly member to sponsor their request. The idea is that if you're approached and you agree to sponsor a request, you could include, you can provide them information. We'll update the community grant request form per our discussion. We can bring that back to you in December, and include staff. And we've have an email that we can include with that. And that will loop us in to help get information from those organizations. But it lines out the assembly review process, when grants are funded, that there has to be a memorandum of agreement, and that really their award starts in July. They shouldn't start spending as soon as the assembly says okay. And so just to provide that as a guidance to them. And what we'd like to do with your blessing is put both of these on the Assembly Grants webpage so that anybody could download them. You could also easily direct people to them. Our website, juneau.org/grants, takes them directly to your Assembly Grants page. And it is full of historical information, as well as we'll update it with current information as we go through the process. So that's really all we had on that. Just wanted to make sure you were comfortable with kind of that approach to the information, and see if there was anything that you wanted to have adjusted in that.
Thank you, Ms. Slick. I'll just add a bit of context for everyone, and especially our newer assembly members. This process really came out of, in the past, it was a bit random, kind of who was included in the budget. And so we wanted a bit more formal process so we could be transparent with the public and make sure everyone had an opportunity. But we also didn't want to, knowing that every year we'd be in a different financial situation, not wanting to put out kind of a large RFP to anyone looking for funding. We didn't want to spend a bunch of time putting together a proposal if there was a low likelihood that they would be funded. And so that's where the idea of sponsorship came in, that it'll be our job as we go through this process as assembly members of selecting opportunities that we really think have a shot in our current realities of making it through the budget cycle. So we'll have more on this once we get closer to the budget cycle, but just to let people know that that's some of the intent behind the process. But any questions at this stage? Mr. Kelly.
I had a possible idea for a possible improvement to this. Would now be kind of the time you're looking for any of that feedback, or would that maybe be at a different time?
No, I think feedback now is welcome.
Okay. Just my experience, last year having been a new assembly member, I saw organizations who I would have supported approaching other assembly members. And I think, being it was my first year on the assembly, I think in large degree I was kind of an unknown. And so I'm kind of wondering if there's some way, something we can do in this process that maybe an interested party could reach out and say, like, I'm looking for an assembly sponsor on this. This is what I do, and then, yeah.
That's a good question, and we talked a little bit about it, just to, because folks will come to staff and say, how do we find a sponsor? And so I think the goal moving forward is, to encourage organizations to email the full assembly if you haven't identified someone who's willing to sponsor you. So in some cases, the request may come from us. We may work with an organization and kind of be proactive to develop something on them. But if it's an organization that doesn't really know who they want to work with, then emailing the full assembly is probably how they'd be directed, reminding them not to put a whole bunch of work into a big email with a whole bunch of materials, but at least making sure they have seen it from us. Would that kind of satisfy your concerns, Mr. Kelly?
I think it does. Thank you.
Appreciate that feedback. Mr. Bryson?
I just want to make sure that it was real clear that finance staff is going to come up with, when an organization says, I've got a thing that I think could qualify for community grants, they'll get like a packet that says, this is the information that we need to see, so it'll be a little bit more uniform. We keep getting better at this like every year. We'll figure it out one day.
Yes, that is kind of the main improvement I think we want to make this year is once the assembly member says, yes, I want to sponsor it, put some responsibility on staff to make sure the partner is clearly communicated with, because we all are busy and we don't want it to be our fault that an organization isn't funded. Mr. Kelly?
Sure, and I think I actually was just looking for this here. It occurs to me maybe it's here and I missed it. But just for the benefit of the new members, so when NSM members sponsored something, they could co-sponsor with up to 2 other assembly members. So, just because of open meeting rules.
Ms. Hughes Candies?
Thanks, Ms. Chair. I think just because we're talking about it now, it's a good, I'll try to incept us all as many times as possible. And then it's going to be our responsibility. I would recommend that we don't sponsor things that we're not going to vote for. So you really only want to sponsor things that you're going to try to champion.
Read that you think you're going to. And we will have a update on the budget here in the next month. And I think just acknowledging we've been in a different financial situation the last 3 years than we may find ourselves this year. We had a fund balance that was sizable thanks to pandemic relief funding and other things. We may not have all of the same number of community requests that we want to sponsor this year, but in case we do, we've got a process for it. Ms. Hall.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, is the history of who typically applies and is awarded these grants on the website? Okay, I'm saying yes.
Ms. Hall, not necessarily everybody who applied, but everybody who was awarded is on that grants website. There's a spreadsheet that goes back to like 10 years, 10 or 15 years worth of, a lot of history.
Okay.
But not necessarily everybody who applied that didn't get funded.
Follow-up question, would there be a way to find out that information?
There is always a way. Let me see what I can do for you. I'm not sure how we've captured that all in the past. We probably have some old lists that we could cobble together.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on this item? All right, then we will move to utility rates. Thank you for being here. If you could introduce yourself and or yourselves and let us know what you want to say.
Thank you, Chair Wall. My name is Denise Koch, and I am the Director of Engineering and Public Works for CBJ. And I am passionate about drinking water and the sewer system, which is probably something that you don't hear many people say. maybe some perspective on that besides the fact that I'm the Director of Engineering and Public Works. My background is in public health. I have a public health degree. I worked at the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation for many years. And this infrastructure, I mean, I think is the definition of critical infrastructure. I mean, I can't think of many things that are more central and critical to people's lives than these sorts of services. And I think that typically, we turn on the tap and you expect water to be there. You flush the toilet and you expect it to go away. You don't want to think more about it, which I understand. But there is a really robust system that's behind all of those things. And periodically, we need to bring visibility to these really extensive and important systems, especially when we're talking about things that are always difficult, like rate increases. We had our last scheduled rate increase just went into effect this July 1st of 2024. But of course, we've known that that's coming, and we have been talking to our utility advisory board for over a year. I think we're probably at about a year and a half on this subject, and that utility advisory board is a citizen oversight board, and I just wanted to acknowledge and thank our UAB chair, Andrew Campbell, for being here tonight. We have spent a lot of time in that UAB talking about rate increases and looking at this from many different angles, and there are different perspectives that are all represented by charter on that board. But the board supports and acknowledges that we're in a position where we need utility rate increases. We had done some of our own work on this in terms of, we had our own spreadsheets and started sharpening our pencils. And when it was clear that those rate increases, they looked like they were, it looked like we needed significant amounts of money. I wanted to take a pause there and to hire some outside expertise I'm not an accountant, and that's what we got some accounting expertise in FCS. They also have assisted CBJ in the past. They've participated in the 2014 utility rate study. So they've got some of that history and that accounting depth. And then at the end of the presentations tonight, this is mostly informational, but of course we always want guidance, and direction is always welcome from the Assembly. One of our longest-standing utility advisory board members, Mr. Jeff Larson, who I believe might be listening via Zoom today, had really recommended that we go to have a public meeting and share this information with the public and have that background. That sounded like a really good idea to us. I want to make sure that that's something that the Assembly feels comfortable with. We want to make sure that we answer this committee's, all of your questions and provide you with all the information that you need before we go out and have a more general public meeting. Our initial thought process is we were thinking something along the lines of more of an open house style of meeting, because there's a lot of numbers in here, and that would give people an opportunity to walk through at their own speed and absorb the numbers at their own speed, and maybe have some interactive elements, like you could sit down at a laptop, and depending on the kind of customer that you are, you can see the rate that you pay now and the rate that you would pay, the dollar amount that you would pay under different rate scenarios. And I think with that, unless you've got other questions for me, I was going to hand the baton over to Utility Superintendent Brian McGuire.
Okay, good evening. Hope you all are doing well tonight. My name is Brian McGuire. I've been the utility superintendent for about 6 years. I've had the privilege of working with the men and women that make sure that when you open the tap, the water comes out, and when you flush the toilet, it goes away, and it's treated properly between that and the channel. So thanks a lot. I've got a quick presentation here. I want to
Brian, when you're ready, just say next page and Adrian is.
Okay, all right, great, okay, all right, I'm sorry, I had a echo here, okay. Yeah, well, I'd like to start out and talk a little bit about, I want to contextualize sort of the size of the infrastructure we have here. First, I'd like to take a look at some of the work we've done in the last year, kind of review of that, highlight some of the history that I was able to learn, and then close with what our teams focus on every day as a purpose. So next slide, please. This is a sort of an overview of our wastewater infrastructure. You'll see it, the red lines there are the pipes in the ground, and you'll see the 3 plants drawn out over here. Those plants were all originally built in the 70s and had some measure, 2 of them had some measure of upgrade around the 80s or the 90s. And there's quite a bit of infrastructure there. There's 140 miles of pipe. There's 45 sewer lift stations, which I've learned is more than Anchorage has actually. We're sort of a long, skinny city, and so it requires a little bit more to move things around. And then 7,100 service connections. The original cost of the infrastructure I learned was about $109 million way back in the day. Next one, please. This is the analogous look at the water infrastructure. The blue pipes are the water pipes in the ground, and we have 2 main water sources on the south end of our city. One at Last Chance Basin and then one at Salmon Creek. This one is a little bit bigger from a pipe. It stretches farther north as far as Stevens Point and is as far south as the rock dump in South Douglas. And that has quite a bit of infrastructure too. In addition to the treatment plants, there's 6, you can read it, 6 reservoirs. There's quite a few pump stations. We regulate a lot of pressure because our reservoirs are up off the ground to make sure we keep pressure throughout the city. It's about 175 miles of pipe and 8,500 people. And another about $110 million also is originally installed. So the history here is the last utility rate increase took effect. It was the last of 5. It started this July. And the last 5-year increase for review was about 4%, and then it was 2% a year ending this fiscal year. And just to be clear, the request we're talking about is the next 5-year period that starts next July. So a little history on, for those, some of you have already seen some of this before. We presented this back in '23 to the Public Works. At that time, this was before we actually had the independent rate study done, but we estimated about 10 to 15% rate increases for each year of that 5-year period. And we presented again in August of this year. And again, as Denise touched on, we've been working collaboratively with the Utilities Advisory Board for at least last year. So a little bit about how we got here. Did some study, some history. The UAB helped us with this as well and looked at some of the records that we were able to find. But we split it into 2 20-year periods, ending this year. The first 20 years, the infrastructure was all relatively new. In fact, Mendenhall had just had a modernization from traditional flow-through plant like the Juneau Douglas plant and to the current sequential batch reactor configuration it's in now. And I believe that was funded entirely with federal grants. There were a few rate increases over this period. The utility had an overall operating loss over this period, I learned, and there was no depreciation fund set up at all. The second 20-year period can be looked at sort of as a consequence or realization of what was going on for that first 20 years. The Assembly formed the Utilities Advisory Board. We meet as often as monthly and go over some of our efforts. The rate increase efforts began. There were two that covered 10-year periods, 2004 to 14, and then that to 24. And there was some sales tax, I should include that in there. There were some sales tax contributions I think they were the last 5 or 6 years in general. But overall, the recommendations that were made through the rate studies were not exactly met in all cases. So please, the next one. This is just a blow up of that first one to kind of take a look at what that is. You guys have it in your packet, but the orange on both graphs is sort of what the rate study suggested, and then the blue were what was actually done. In a few cases, there were years where there was no rate increase, and we got something, and then there were others where there was some, and we didn't get any. Next slide, please. And this is just the wastewater analog to that. So next slide, please. Another part of the story is inflation. Try to graphically represent this here in a simple way. The gray line is the CPI for urban Alaska from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a dollar for dollar increase starting in 1992, which is, and then we also have the dollar for dollar increase starting in 92 of the water and sewer rates next to it. So you'll see the basket of goods that are described in that index outpaced the cost of those outpaced the cost increases of the utility. Next, please. So what do our men and women that work for us start the day? You know, our goal and our mission is to support community health through providing essential services. I told my staff during the pandemic that, you know, we're invisible by nature, and we're not getting a lot of the love that our brothers in fire and police are getting. But the minute we go down, they go down right behind us. So don't ever doubt how important the services they provide are. We try to do that through reliability and resilience. You know, reliability is making sure whenever you open that valve or flush the toilet, what you expect to happen happens. Resilience is if we have a problem, you either don't know about it or it happens really short. We're able to get back on our feet and resume service. We spend a lot of time on maintenance and then safety and security. You know, recently, if you may have heard around the country, there's been some service interruptions. They had some in Florida for water. They had some cyber attacks that shut down plants and shut down power stations and things like that. Those are things we're more concerned about now. But those all go into maintaining the ability to provide these services. And before I turn it over to our outside expertise, we wanted an objective viewpoint and somebody that's an organization that had deep experience and also was in both accounting and utilities. The team was the Dow Engineering and FCS. And more than anything, we wanted just, you know we look at every day, and it's hard to you know, you kind of get set in the ways you look, and it's good to have an objective eye to point out things you may have missed. So before I turn it over to Paul at FCS, I wanted to just go over the last two things that Denise talked about. Again, what we're looking for next is some feedback on public meetings, you know, and what you might want to get out of that, how that would be helpful. And then Paul will present some options that we've come up with, and maybe some guidance on one of those. So I think that's it. Bring Paul on here.
Should maybe see if there's any questions before we go to the next presentation. Any questions so far? Mr. Bryson.
So the citizens of Juneau did approve $10 million for water, wastewater infrastructure. How does that impact this situation?
Paul's going to talk about some of that, but it did help. It certainly helped. That was an item that we were going to find either way. So the fact that we were able to get that's not included in any of the remaining funding options.
All right, Mr. Quinn, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me. My name is Paul Quinn. I'm the project manager on the water and wastewater rate study. I'm here to present to you the findings for the study. These findings were previously presented to the Public Works and Facility Committee in August. So I'm here to present the findings to you all. And let's go to the next slide. So before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to talk briefly about the past rate study, look at some of the results from that study. We'll talk about the overview of the revenue requirement and what a rate study is. We'll go through some of the key assumptions for both of the utilities, but primarily we're going to be spending tonight's discussion on the results, looking at some impacts for our customers, and welcoming your feedback and direction on the scenarios I'm going to present to you. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm trying to show you some of the impacts looking at the last rate study. The last rate study took a 10 or 11 year look, fiscal year 14 through fiscal year 24. The orange bars there represent the anticipated rate revenue that was coming out of the last rate study based on the proposed rate increases. The blue bar represents the actual rate revenue that we collected under both utilities. You'll notice for water, there's that 7 million gap for water. There's that 25 million gap for sewer. The reason we've collected, or the main reason we've collected less revenue in both utilities is because we've deviated from that rate path starting in 2020. Again, we should have seen a little bit more revenue for water and quite a bit more revenue or cash on the sewer utility. Next slide, please. In terms of what goes into a rate study or a revenue requirement analysis, here on the left, we have the uses of cash. So those could include operating expenses, debt service repayments, our capital program. We have to make sure we're hitting our fiscal policies, including any minimum cash reserves we want to hold. Now we're going to try and balance those uses of cash with the sources of cash coming in the door. The main sources of cash for the utilities are our rate revenue or our monthly user rates. We do have some miscellaneous rates to rely on. We do have some existing cash reserves we can draw down on over time, and we can turn to the debt markets if we want to finance some of our capital projects through debt. Now, the main question we are asking ourselves in the revenue requirement or rate study analysis is we want to determine the amount of annual rate revenue that is needed to fund all our ongoing financial obligations on a standalone basis. That standalone basis is important. We're evaluating the water and sewer utilities independently of each other. We're not assuming one utility is going to subsidize another utility. Now, as we think about our capital program, there are going to be ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys. And so it's really important from a financial perspective to look at a multi-year forecasting period to make sure that we are anticipating any peak years of capital and we're not going to fall off a cliff. We're going to have a funding plan or a funding strategy in place to get our capital funded. And so that's exactly what we did. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in this slide, there's some key assumptions for both of the utilities. And as I mentioned, it's really important to take a multi-year perspective when we're doing any sort of forecasting. So in the top left there, we are looking at a study period of 2025 through 2030. The budget, the 25 and fiscal year 26 budgets were used as a baseline to set our operating cost forecast. We've forecasted operating costs into the future using a various number of annual inflationary metrics. Anywhere from 4 to 5% annual inflation was assumed, depending on what type of cost we're looking at. And you can go through this here. There's a lot of different assumptions that we've baked into the analysis in terms of what we're trying to achieve. For the sake of timing, though, I will move on and try and get us to the results tonight. Next slide, please. So briefly touch on the capital plan. So the capital plan was developed by staff and in conjunction with the engineering partner Dowell. They developed 3 different capital plan alternatives to be considered by the utilities. Those range from a small capital plan to a really extensive capital plan taking care of all the infrastructure needs for each utility. For tonight's discussion, we're going to be focusing primarily on that smallest capital plan or the reduced capital plan. I'll talk a little bit about why once we take a look at results. The capital plans were developed for a 5-year period, fiscal 26 through fiscal year 2030. And this smallest capital plan or the reduced capital plan that we're focusing on does address some of the highest priority projects, but it is deferring other high priority projects and other non-priority projects outside of the study period. So let's look at the next slide. So on this slide here, I wanted to show you kind of visually how different some of these capital plan alternatives are. As I mentioned before, staff and Dowell developed 3 alternatives. We have the reduced plan, the moderate or middle of the road plan, and the extensive plan. You can see there is quite a bit of difference between that reduced plan, which we are going to be primarily focusing on tonight, and the extensive plan, which includes, hitting all of the needs of the capital needs for the utilities. It's important to note that under the reduced plan, there is risk to utility service, although staff does feel comfortable moving forward with this plan at this time. So let's look at the next slide. So we're going to jump into the results now, starting with the water utility. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. And so on this slide, I am showing you a forecast of the operating revenues and expenditures for the water utility. The blue and orange bars represent our ongoing expense obligations. The blue bars represent our operating expenses. The orange bars represent our ongoing debt service repayments. That solid black line represents our annual operating revenues coming in the door before we make any future rate adjustments. And so what we're seeing here is you can see that that solid line is greater than the bars. There's that gap between the line and the bars. And so what that means is the water utility is generating some cash flow above its operating expenses that can be used to fund the capital plan. On average, over this 6-year window, the utility is generating about $1.8 million per year, which again, can then be used to fund the capital plan. Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we look at the capital plan now, the annual spend rate over the 6 years.
Interrupt you quickly for a question. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Quinn. On the previous slide, and sorry if you said it earlier, why the variation in revenues? Like, why does it go up slightly and then go down and then go flat? Is that?
Yep. So there is, we are projecting, or you all do earn some interest on unused cash balances. So we're projecting to earn a couple $100,000 in the front end of the plan, but without any rate adjustments, those cash balances are being used up to fund the capital plan. And so you're just, you're projected to earn less interest earnings on those fund balances in year 3 or so of the plan. And so that revenue takes a slight dip in that year.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Standinger.
Just since we're stopped on this slide and kind of talking about some of the assumptions going into this, I noticed on your slide 5 on your inflation expectations are significantly higher than what the Fed has published as inflation expectations. Can you speak to that? Is that like an industry specific expectation for the cost drivers for water and wastewater, or is there something that's leading to that?
Yeah, so we did spend quite a bit of time at the front end of the study discussing what inflationary expectations we wanted to bake in to the analysis. As you mentioned, they may be slightly higher than what the Fed is targeting on the federal level. We do know that Juneau is in a little bit of a unique position where we are seeing higher inflationary numbers relative to a federal average type of rate. So we did want to reflect that we are anticipating relative to maybe a federal average, that we are anticipating slightly higher inflation relative to that average.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On that, and maybe this is something that we can get in the future, is your inflation numbers, or your projections, and how do those compare to historical cost growth for specifically? And again, if you don't have that offhand, we could maybe get that later.
Yeah, and so it really varies depending on what expense we're looking at. I might highlight the sewer utility specifically. The sewer utility does spend quite a bit of cash on shipping expenditures, shipping in chemical costs, and shipping out, processed biosolids. Those shipping costs have, doubled, if not tripled, in the past couple of years. So they have seen some, very high inflationary numbers just over the past 5 years. It's really hard to understand where, those shipping costs might go going forward. But again, that kind of goes back to the inflationary numbers we wanted to assume. We do know, like we mentioned, that the Fed might be anticipating lower overall inflationary on a national average, but we have been experiencing, very high inflationary numbers over the past couple of years, and we didn't want to be caught off guard if that is something that's going to be continuing.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Wool. I just wanted to add that that's such a great and insightful question, and we had so many discussions about what the right numbers were, which is of course almost impossible to know for certain. But we did look to our recent past experience and what we've been especially on the capital side, the inflationary pressures that we've seen in our projects, and this is beyond just sewer or drinking water projects, but projects that engineering and public works as a whole is the project manager on. We've seen projects in some areas, like our costs, almost double in about 5 years. So in particular in that construction area, we have definitely experienced higher inflation than we do in our regular lives, like at the grocery store. So some of that is based on our recent construction experience.
And I may mention one additional item on the inflationary numbers. As we mentioned, we are partnering with the engineering consulting firm Dowell. They have a lot of expertise in the immediate area in terms of these construction costs, and they weighed really heavily on the inflationary expectations that we've baked into the analysis.
Thanks for those good questions. Mr. Quinn, you can continue.
Sure. So I believe we were on slide 10, looking at the water capital plan. So as I mentioned on the earlier slide, the utility is generating about $1.8 million on average per year, which can be used to fund capital projects. When we look at the 6-year spend rate for the utility, that average spend rate is just over $4 million. So we have that $2 million deficit for water, where we need to either look towards rate increases, toward the debt markets, or somewhere else to find a source of revenue to help us fund the identified capital program. Over the 6-year period, we're anticipating about $25 million in capital projects. And as I mentioned before, this is under that reduced plan. Now staff and the engineering partners Dowell work very hard and to identify, what is the, minimum level of spend that the utility can get by over this 6-year period. When we look at all the capital needs that the utility requires, we're deferring almost 90% of those projects outside this window. So what we're looking at here really represents kind of the minimum level of capital spending that the water utility needs over this 6-year period. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for your consideration tonight, we've developed 2 scenarios. The first scenario asks, what if we finance the capital plan all through rate increases? So 100% cash funding. Obviously, this is going to lead to the highest rate impacts for our customers. So the second scenario we considered was introducing a little bit of debt into the mix. So staff did a little work looking at the state loans that might be available. And they're comfortable moving forward with the assumption that we would be able to secure just over $4 million in state loans for the water utility over that 5 or 6 year window. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend 2 slides just talking about the state loans. The first slide on the forgiveness program. So the state does offer some forgiveness on some of the state loans they offer. Typically, the way this works is they're going to rank all jurisdictions in the state, and they're going to prioritize disadvantaged communities. What they consider disadvantaged communities is primarily income-based metrics. And so when they rank all jurisdictions in the state, they compare the rankings across all the different jurisdictions to figure out who is considered a disadvantaged community in their eyes. Unfortunately, when we think about Juneau in our community, we're not really considered a disadvantaged community according to the state, so we're really not considered a good candidate for loan forgiveness. Doesn't mean that staff isn't going to try to reach to get forgiveness, but it's not something we should be planning on at this point in time. Next slide, please. And then in terms of our loan assumptions that we've baked into the analysis, I mentioned we're targeting loans from the state. It's through the Department of Environmental Conservation. The assumptions we've included is a 20-year term length at 2.75% interest rate. There's a couple pros to issuing debt. The first one, intergenerational equity. What does that mean? So intergenerational equity, we're going to try and align the payment of the asset with the folks who are actually going to benefit from using that asset. And so when we think about the utility assets, typically these are assets that are going to be going to have an asset life of decades. And so by debt financing those assets, we are better aligning the cost or the repayment of the assets with the life and the customers who are going to benefit. So if a customer connects to the system in 10 or 15 years, they're still going to be on the hook for repaying some assets that might have been built 15 years ago, but are still benefiting them now. By cash financing our assets, we're putting all of the burden on today's ratepayer, even though they might not see the benefit over the lifetime of the asset. The other pro is by introducing debt, we're able to buy down some of the increases. The obvious con is issuing debt. We are on the hook for the repayment over that 20-year repayment life. Last thing I'll mention here is there's essentially no impact to CBJ's ability to issue debt or their debt capacity based on the amount of debt we're looking at for the utilities. Next slide, please. So this slide, I'm going to show you some results for those 2 scenarios. I'm primarily going to be focused on the impacts to a fixed rate residential bill. It's important to note that these rate increases would apply to all customers in the system. So under that cash funding approach, typical residential customer pays about $41 per month. They would see their bill increase anywhere from $4 to $6 per month over that 5-year window. Ultimately, the bill would end up around $66. When we introduce a little bit of debt, that monthly bill impact is anywhere from $3 to $4 per month, and we end up around $57 per month in 2030. I will point out that we did run the scenarios for all the capital alternatives. So if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, I'm showing you some of the impacts if we had decided to move forward with that middle of the road or moderate CIP scenario. Under that CIP scenario, the water bill would have increased anywhere from $95 to $115 by 2030. So you can see there, it's quite a big jump by moving to that middle of the road CIP scenario. And so when we ran the numbers and reviewed them internally, it really became clear that the middle of the road CIP or the extensive CIP, which saw even bigger increases, is just unpalatable, and we don't think we can move forward with it based on the impacts to our customer base. That is why we're really focusing on that reduced CIP plan for tonight's discussion. So maybe I'll pause there. The next couple slides have to do with the sewer utility, but are there any questions on these scenarios for the water utility at this time?
Any questions? I don't see any yet. Keep rolling.
Okay. So go to the next slide, please. So we'll jump into the results for the sewer utility. It's going to be about the same format that we went through for water. Here I'm showing you the operating expenses and revenues. Again, the operating expenses are shown in blue. The ongoing existing debt is shown in orange. Our annual revenues before any rate adjustments are shown on that solid black line. So unlike water, where we saw that gap between the black line or our revenues and the bars or our expenses, there's really no gap here for sewer. In fact, what we're projecting is that by fiscal year 27, our operating expenses would be greater than the revenues we're collecting. In other words, we would have to draw down on our existing cash reserves, just to keep the lights on and pay our salaries, right? So right away, there's a need for rate action to get those operating revenues above our operating expenses. The other important takeaway here is, unlike the water utility, the sewer utility is generating no cash flow on an ongoing basis to address or fund its capital program. So let's go to the next slide. So when we think about the sewer capital plan, the average spend rate over the 6-year period is about $6 million here. As I mentioned before, on average, the sewer utility is generating no cash flow to fund those costs. The total program over the 6-year window is about $36 million. And just like the water utility, this is that reduced plan. This is the plan that staff has worked really hard on to identify what is that minimum level of spend we can get by with. We are deferring more than 90% of the other identified projects outside of this study window. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about 4 scenarios for sewer. The first 2, we're going to kind of recap what if that bond vote had failed. You all had to vote on that bond about a month ago. That was a $10 million bond to fund the Clarifier project. We wanted to show you some of the impacts of if that bond vote had failed, what would we be looking at? Those 2 scenarios where what if the bond vote failed and we had to fund everything through cash, or what if that bond vote had failed and we took on a little bit of additional state loan debt to fund some other projects. After that, we're going to focus on the 2 scenarios that we're asking for your consideration. That is, the bond vote has passed. Now we need to decide, do we fund all other capital projects through rates or cash, or do we introduce a little additional state loans to fund some other projects? Let's go to the next slide, please. So on this slide, I'm showing you some of those impacts based on the assumption that that bond vote had failed. So a current flat rate residential customer pays about $106 per month. That would have increased immediately by $31 to $36 right away. In other words, about a 30% rate increase, next year. Following that year, in 2027, we would have seen another pretty sizable increase, anywhere from $26 to $28 per month, or in percentage terms, about 20%. Thereafter, we kind of right the ship and we're able to move by with more inflationary type adjustments for these scenarios. But again, the single biggest lever that the sewer utility could pull, at least in the next year or 2, is getting that bond vote passed. We're able to mitigate or spread out the rate increases over a multi-year window instead of doing them all up front. So let's look at the next slide, please. So really, The scenarios that we're asking for your consideration are these two scenarios I'm showing you here. The bond vote has passed. So now we have to ask ourselves, do we want to fund the remainder of the capital through cash? Or do we take on another $4 or $5 million of state loans to buy down the rate increases just a little bit more? So under that cash scenario, typical bill of $106 would increase anywhere from $13 to $21 per month, depending on the year we're looking at. We would end the 2030 period about $191 per month. If we introduce a little bit of state loans, we're able to buy that down slightly. So instead of a $14 to $20 impact, it is a $12 to $18 impact per month, or a bill ending around $180 in the 2030 time period. Now, just like water, we did run the scenarios for the other capital alternatives. I'm showing you on the right-hand side of this slide some of the impacts under that middle of the road capital scenario. You'll see the 2030 bill under the middle of the road capital plan is anywhere from $212 to about $219, depending on which scenario we're looking at. You might be saying, well, that's not a whole lot different than the numbers I'm looking at under this reduced plan. But really the big impact here on the sewer side, if you look kind of towards the bottom right-hand side, is the upfront increase that middle of the road scenario would have caused. So if we wanted to move forward with that middle of the road scenario, we would have been looking at a upfront increase next year of 50 to 65% right away. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So two more slides here. I wanted to show you a rate survey comparing our current rates against some of our neighboring jurisdictions. This is a little apples and oranges. All utilities are unique. Every utility has different geographical footprints. Every utility has different unique customer demands that they're placed on the system. So it's really hard to compare, on an apples to apples basis, these rates, but we're always asked to see how we stack up against our neighbors. So there's really two key takeaways that I'm looking at here. You'll notice that we are kind of in the mid to high end of those that are surveyed, but a lot of our neighbors have what we call a 301H waiver designation. And so what that means is that they're exempt from certain secondary treatment processes on the sewer side. In other words, they have less costs, they have less assets they need to maintain and replace. And so I would expect those communities that are exempt from those costs to have lower sewer rates than you. And that's what we're seeing pretty much across the board. When we look at your water rates are one of, if not the lowest water rate in the area based on the ones we surveyed. So those are the two takeaways looking at this survey. Go to the next slide, please. And finally, in terms of next steps, so.
A question in here.
Sure.
Mr. Steininger.
Thank you. On the sewer operating cost basket on slide 16, the graph shows that pretty quickly current revenues aren't going to be sufficient to fund basic operations, maintenance, and existing debt.
Sure.
Did you calculate just what portion of these proposed rate increases are necessary just to get current revenues to cover operations and maintenance, so that we can kind of get an understanding of what proportion of that rate increase is just absolutely necessary to keep the lights on versus funding the capital improvement?
Yep. So just to, right the ship on an operating side, you would need about a 4% increase per year over the 5-year window.
And then kind of a second question that goes for both the sewer and the water. These are presented as a kind of hypothetical for an individual, residential customer.
Mm-hmm.
Numbers, what these rate increases would look like in aggregate across the whole system, like how many millions in additional revenue compared to the millions in additional costs, both for, with debt revenue separated out from, ratepayer revenue, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't have the figures right in front of me, but they're easily available to me. Those are certainly something I can pull and send your way if you're interested.
Thank you.
Thanks. You can go ahead and finish us off.
So in terms of next steps, we're looking for your direction on the two scenarios for both utilities. Again, those are what if we cash finance the CIP? In sewers side, we have the 10 million bond. So what if we cash finance the rest of the capital? And the second scenario is what if we introduced, $4 to $5 million of additional state loans to help lower the rate increases over this 5 or 6 year window. The other item we are looking for your feedback today is, as Brian and Denise had mentioned, in terms of next steps, we were looking for your comment on what you're thinking of a public meeting. Do you think that's a good next step? And if you do think that's a good next step, do you have any comments on, do you want it to be a more formal presentation like I'm doing tonight? Do you want something more informal where, myself and staff is walking around the room answering questions? And how would you like to receive information back from that public meeting? So with that, I'd like to end my presentation and open it up for any further questions.
Thank you for that. Let's start with questions and then we can provide some comments, feedback. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. Mr. Steiner's question actually kind of provoked a thought of my own. So we've made certain assumptions about inflation, but have we made any assumptions about population growth or decline in estimating what the impact would be per utility customer?
Yeah, so we did make some assumptions on growth, and essentially we've assumed minimal growth over this 6 year window. That seems to be consistent with what we're hearing from the state in terms of their population expectations for the state of Alaska.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are shipping dried bio-waste out of the community. We bought this awesome dryer so that we didn't have to do that and then had to ship it out anyways. Could one of these capital expenses be the technology that allowed us to not have to ship out the dried bio-waste? Director Koch, could you remind us how much money we are spending on an annual basis to ship our dried bio-waste down south because of the PFAS?
Yeah, I can answer that.
Please.
I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's on the order of $2 million a year is what we're spending.
So we spend $2 million a year to ship our dry bio-waste down south. Is there a technology that we could purchase or make part of the CIP so that we did not have to ship our dried bio-waste down south, like an incineration or there's a couple of technologies that negate the PFAS so that we don't have to ship it out of town and essentially it's dirt again?
Yes, sir. We've been looking at, over the past few years, actually, a couple technologies that are out there that one of the things we want to do in addition to stop shipping is, there's been some, we want to make sure that we properly account for a low level of PFAS that we found in our biosolids. That's one of the main reasons why it's not a Class A biosolid. So yes, we've been looking at a couple of those and have been exploring how they handle the complication of burning. But I'm sorry.
Could you speak, just tell us a little bit about the dryer? How old is the dryer? How much did we spend to get this dryer? Maybe just tell us about the bio-waste dryer just a little bit.
Sure. The dryer is a belt dryer, and it was installed. I think it was installed it was started in 2017 and finished in 2019 or 2020 when we started it up. It was two $10 million loans, so it was a total of $20 million. And it's been operating ever since we started up in 2020.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know that you just did these projections for 5 years, and maybe beyond that, it's not much use. But I guess I'm just kind of seeing things, like we're looking at kind of the maybe it's not minimal, but the reduced capital plan, I guess, with these increases, depending on how we pay for it, I mean, is there and you know, inflation expectations, I guess with this type of plan, what type of rate increases should we expect in the years, you know, 6 through 10? Like, would we be expecting similar, or are we now catching up so they should go down? Anyway, I'm just trying to think beyond this 5-year time frame.
Ms. And maybe that's for you.
Yeah, so maybe I can comment. I mean, we could take a look at that. We haven't looked outside of 2030 because we don't have a good idea of what the capital program layout is after that. So if we wanted to take a look outside of 2030, we would need to work with staff to understand, you know, what are the capital expenses we should be planning for outside of that time period.
Mr. Steininger.
This might be kind of the same question, but a different flavor. When I looked at this, the difference in the extensive, moderate, reduce, the extensive is over $500 million and reduce is about 56 million. How within that, you know, the number one $500 million, is that like every capital need that you are currently aware of? Is that something that if we magically had $500 million, you could execute in the next 6 years? Like, what kind of is the timeline that you have in mind for that nature of project?
Well, first of all, the extensive plan was every, that's based on need. That's published every year in the capital plan and updated. And if, I'm sorry, could you repeat the
I guess I'm trying to get an idea of like when within that $500 million, when are those projects going to be, you know, become a dire need or become something that has to be executed to keep the system running? You know, it kind of goes to the question from Mr. Smith, you know, 5 years, 6 years down the road, you know, what's our capital plan gonna look like, considering we're considered that what's under consideration here is a minimal capital plan. You know, in 6 years, are you gonna have 100 million out of this $500 million that we're gonna have to contend with? Or is you know, roughly $10 million a year sort of plan something sustainable over the long term?
Through the chair to Mr. Steininger, maybe I could start us off and Brian could, you know, fill in any gaps. So in our 6-year CIP, when we identify what we think the outlying and the non-committed years of our budget entail, there is admittedly less accuracy and in the out years. And it probably isn't even realistic that we could like do that full, like if, like you said, you're hypothetical, like if we just got, you know, manna from heaven, could we even do that full level of work in, you know, 5 years? Because there's still constraints that we have for project managers and moving through a procurement system and those sorts of things. So we had started there just as a little bit of, I guess, a starting point, but I think that capturing, doing all of that work in that the highest level is not really realistic. We had gone then, and of course then the increases were way too wildly high. So we had gone back to say, okay, let's not look at our full wish list of every project that we would like to get done, but look at that moderate plan and that reduced plan. And maybe I'll pass this baton to Superintendent McGuire, because he could elaborate on some of the criteria that we use for, you know, what makes some capital project, you know, fit into the reduced plan, which is essentially something that's like, we really, really think that we need and we just cannot put off without really serious consequences, versus, you know, what distinguishes something from falling in that reduced plan versus that moderate plan.
Yes, when we started out with that large plan and said, you know, we need to take it down here, we've identified risk or threat classes to each enterprise's infrastructure. And, you know, for water, we looked at system controls and security. We looked at condition of equipment like end of life or obsolescence. For instance, you know, for water itself, we had a valley water supply disruption concern. And then it's important that we have road reconstruction. But for instance, whatever these are, we've identified these for each one of them. And we went through everything in that big list and said, does this project address this risk or a piece of this risk? And if it did, it got a point. And so we wound up with projects. Some projects had, I think, 2, 3 points. Some had 0. And so the reduced plan was one that had all the 2s in it and a chunk of the 1s and almost none of the 0s, or really none of the 0s. And then the reduced plan was one that was a select group of 1s and then all the 2s. And so we were trying to address projects that we thought were the most critical for service continuity based on what we know right now about the condition of the infrastructure.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess just a question on the, you know, using debt. Okay, I'm sorry, I think maybe it's there, but just to confirm that the debt for water and water would be, you know, 4.3 million, and then the debt for sewer, should we decide to go that way, it would be 4.8. Okay, maybe I found it in the documents, but is that correct? That's how much debt we'd be taking on with that debt plan. Is that right?
That is correct. Yep.
Thank you.
As we maybe transition to some committee comments, Ms. Koch, I think it would be helpful before we give some feedback to kind of understand what are the official decision points moving forward, who's making them, what kind of timeline we think we're on.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. And that's a good reminder because I said I was going to speak to that and I completely forgot in my opening remarks. So thank you for that question. Since our utility is public, ultimately the Assembly makes a decision on what the utility rate increases will ultimately be. And we understand that you have multiple considerations that go into that decision making in terms of affordability for residents, policy calls, financial health, all of those pieces. But especially since when we had done our initial just staff working with UAB, we had our own spreadsheet and we saw that this need was substantial. We really wanted that verification from that deep expertise and the objectivity that we got from Paul Quinn and FCS. So we could start, you know, we to some extent made some initial, decisions in terms of my first reaction to the highest level CIP plan was like, that is just not, I didn't think that was just not tenable. So we kept going back and saying, okay, let's look at that moderate CIP. And I thought, that's still really, those numbers are really high. So we kind of internally made some of those decisions to say, okay, let's look at this most reduced CIP plan. And then asked Paul to really run the majority of his analysis based on that reduced plan. But of course, we could, all of that, we could be redirected by the Assembly, of course. But so we made those first decisions. And then we bounced it off of the Utility Advisory Board, since they have, we have members like, for example, our chair is a contractor, he's taking the contractor seat, there are different seats, there's general public seats, and we had some real deep discussion about the need for utility rate increases. then we thought the best place, the next stop to go would be Public Works and Facilities Committee, seemed logical to us. We asked Public Works and Facilities a similar question in terms of, if that committee had more questions or homework assignments for us before we advanced it to this body, that the decision that was made in that August 2024 meeting was, was ready to advance to this Finance Committee. We want to make sure that we answer any questions that you have, and we've noted Mr. Steininger's question, and we'll get back to you on that. Then we envisioned going out to the public, which was that recommendation, I think a good one from our Utility Advisory Board member, Jeff Larson. But eventually I would envision that we would come back to either to this body or to the Committee of the Whole, and then at some point it goes to the full assembly for decision-making. Does that answer the question?
And so if we provide general comments right now from members, is that enough direction for you to take it forward, or do you need like a formal, we want to do cash or we want to do debt, or?
Ms. Wool, I think just getting the sense of this body would be really helpful for us, and knowing that you agree with the Utility Advisory Board that it would make sense to go out to the general public. We would be I would be more careful when we go into that more general public meeting to say, we're providing some of this information and this data, but ultimately we're providing the information to you, but the assembly is the decision-making body, ultimately not us. So we would be clear that we're not saying these will be the utility rates. This is just what the accounting shows with these sort of scenarios that we put forth. And your general sense of whether a partial debt approach would make sense or not, or you'd really prefer cash, that would help us as we think about how we go out to the general public. I will just add also in terms of the debt portion that Mr. Quinn talked about, there was some strategy associated with, well, how much debt would we, do we think is reasonable, even if this is the direction that the Assembly and the community want to go in. And I think it's a footnote in one of these slides, but we thought about 20%. And for part of the rationale for that is the state money often actually comes originally from the federal government. It has it flows through the state, but it has oftentimes federal government strings associated with it that include things like, Build America, Buy America, and lots of different strings that can significantly increase the costs of construction projects. So there was some thought that went into strategy on using that debt to finance, non-construction projects. So we wouldn't be, we would be benefiting essentially. We're not driving up the cost of those construction projects. So that's why we didn't come to you with a 50%, a scenario of 50% debt financing, because we're trying to balance that, a wise use, even in a proposal of debt.
Thanks, super helpful. I will open it up to committee comments on this topic. Go ahead, Ms. Hughes-Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, thanks everyone for the presentation and answers to the questions. That was great. I think generally speaking, my sense is I'm supportive of debt. I think it's good debt. It's sounds like staff put thought into how to use it advantageously, and it helps bring down the numbers, so that's attractive. For the public meetings, I think a condensed version of this, really hitting some of those, how we're here, how moderate was chosen, what happens if we don't do this type things, having those numbers, at what point the lights, we don't have money to turn the lights on, would be good to include that. My sense is less formal, making sure we offer a chance for people to ask questions. And I would say as much public outreach as we can do around this, because, you know, it's just easy for people to spread information, and we want to make sure the public knows what's up. And I will say that these, you know, as awful, or maybe people don't think they're awful, but they're, you know, after 5 years of increases, we're another 5 years of increases, and these are quite a step different than our last 5 years. That I recall the public coming when we started our last 5-year cycle and saying that these rates were too high. And again, we were choosing the most moderate. So I don't know. I think it's hard to forecast a longer period of time, but as high as these rates are, you know, it's our utility. And so I share your passion for it. And, you know, I would love it if we were doing like the medium option, but I understand why staff chose not to, and I'm fine with that. But I think that's just food for thought for us, because I'm sure people will come and say these rates are too high, and that's real, but also, you know, we need to take care of the utility. So those are my comments.
Mr. Kelly.
If it's all right, I actually had one more question. Ms. Cotton, this is more about like how we present this to the public. Could you describe maybe what you had in mind? Like, were you imagining like maybe a few weeks, a couple months, and a few meetings kind of scattered at different locations around town? Is that what you were thinking?
Through the chair to Mr. Kelly, we really feel like it's essential that we have Paul Quinn be here in person to help have these conversations with the public, since he's done that analysis. His schedule is packed through November. We know then, of course, December is a really tough month because we've got the first couple of weeks and then everybody really leaves for vacation. We have Alaska Municipal League in those first 2 weeks. So there's, we're going to try and see if maybe we could hit that week that's not Alaska Municipal League. But if that's not possible, it really it means functionally it would be the beginning of January before we had a public meeting. And in terms of that, our initial thought, but we're of course open to adjusting based on the body's will, is we thought there's so many numbers in here. This is so dense that we would have a really short presentation, and then we had been brainstorming and thinking about having, I almost think like science fair, poster boards that have some of this information near them on a table, and you know, people could come up and they could really spend the time that they need to spend looking at the numbers instead of we're just like quickly going through a PowerPoint presentation. They could ask us questions about them. So that was our initial thought process.
Thank you.
Other comments?
I'll go ahead and comment on the kind of the format of the public meeting. You know, I think we all benefit from hearing the questions from the audience. You know, there's going to be quite the varying levels of expertise of people showing up to comment. And I think the general audience, you know, we don't know what we don't know. So I would encourage, you know, I like the science fair project. That sounds kind of fun, but it's a little hard for everyone to hear what's being said. So I veer a little more towards more traditional, but you know, I think you can do a bit of both. You know, maybe have the interactive first and then delve into more of a presentation and Q&A. Thank you.
Mr. Steininger.
So I'll preface this with, I'm just concerned that it is a significant rate increase that we'll have to put forward. I do have concerns with the debt side, simply because when I'm looking at this overall balance of need in your capital plan, I'm not necessarily seeing this as a kind of one-time, we issue debt, we fix a big problem, and then our, annual costs will come down and we just pay off that debt over time. We're going to need to have increased revenue across water and wastewater on an annual basis just to deal, on the wastewater side, just to deal with annual operating costs and to deal with a need over the next, who knows how long, of $500 million right now based on your information you have. If we're issuing debt, it's not a one-time thing that we're issuing debt for. That kind of feels a lot more like issuing debt for, annual operating and maintenance costs. And that isn't necessarily the best, I don't believe is necessarily the best way to handle recurring annual costs. But, that said, without the debt option, this is not a very affordable rate increase for a lot of people in town. And so I think I'm kind of mixed on the debt. I'm not inclined in that direction because I see this more as an ongoing need that we're going to have to pay the piper at some point. And if we issue debt now, that just crowds out, the portion of the rates in future years that you'll be able to use for some of these future capital projects. So that's just where my head's at on this. I guess I don't have any real profound comments on the public process piece, so.
Mr. Bryson.
I was only going to comment on something I previously mentioned. As you guys are always looking at this information, as you're trying to figure this out, I know that we've talked about it, there wasn't a technology when we had these discussions about trying to remove the PFAS so that we didn't have to pay $2 million a year to ship our drive-by waste out. But then we also have a large number of storm drains that feed into our sewer system. Could a public outreach or some type of project reduce the amount of storm drains that are feeding right into the sewer system, which would hopefully eventually lower costs if you're processing less water? So while I know that you have increased costs to pay for the projects that are going on, if you guys could look at maybe projects that we could invest in that could reduce overall expenses. A couple of things that I mentioned, for example, but I know that there's one or two things out there like that. Thank you for the time.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. And this time it's a comment. I think I kind of feel the same sort of conundrum as Mr. Steininger. With unknowns out there, I'm not sure exactly about the debt, but I also see this as a potential burden, an extra burden to our ratepayers if we don't go that route. So I think I might be more tending to see what public outreach yields on that, since it will be our constituents who will be paying for this. So in that light, like your answer to my question earlier, it sounded like you might just be planning on holding one meeting. Did I understand correctly?
Through the chair to Mr. Kelly, we had initially thought, one meeting, but we could always do more if that's the will of the body. One of the things we were also balancing is, this likelihood, since we have this narrow window in December, that it's probably more likely that the public meeting would be in January. If we had another public meeting that maybe pushes us to the end of January, and we're also being mindful of this body is going to start working on the overall budgets, the capital budget, the operating budget for the whole city. And we were trying to sort of, in this timing, thread this needle of, while you still have kind of the bandwidth for, how many budget balls you're sort of juggling at one time. But if this body prefers that we have more than one meeting and is fine with that, meaning that we'll have to come back to AFC or COW in February and sort of get in there during a similar timeframe while you're working on the rest of the budget. We're fine either way. We were trying to be mindful of your other budget schedules.
Thank you. And I think my response to that is I think I'm pretty flexible in how we get public input, but I think looking at these rate increases and being that it is an investment for the community and that they will be picking up the cost, that we try to maximize however we can that public outreach.
Is this enough direction for you at this time? I know we don't, there's not immediate consensus on the debt first cash options, which probably means, we provide both to the public, but are you feeling comfortable with what you've heard so far?
Madam Chair, this feedback has been really, really helpful, and I think this gives us enough. We'll follow up. I think we'll get the answers to the questions that Mr. Steininger asked. We'll feed that through you as the chair, and then we'll also get back to you once we have a date for at least that first public meeting, and just keep this body well apprised of what we're doing. And I really appreciate your time. I know this is never a popular, rate increases are never a popular subject.
Thank you so much for educating us on things that I think we all wish we knew more about in our roles, and this has been really educational. Oh, Mr. Smith.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I was a little slow to the draw. I guess one thing I'd be interested, I think Mr. McGuire mentioned it at some point that I'd be interested to know what the sales tax that went into either the water or wastewater utility, like when that happened, and what those, I think there were two numbers. I'd be interested to see that. And then I'm not sure if it's like a need to project out 10 years or something, but I would just expect that when the public sees this and just obviously we need to make investments into this critical infrastructure, but based on these changes, if we do proceed with debt, which is seemingly the cheapest, at least in terms of the near-term cost, I mean, it is almost $100 increase per month by 2030 from where we are today. So that's like nearly $1,000. I would be interested, and I bet the public will want to have some sense too of, are we expecting this to just continue on this trajectory, or are we again getting to a good spot? I realize that's maybe hard to do, but anyway, it seems like that will be a concern or interest of the public. So for what it's worth, thanks.
Thank you, and we can, through the chair, we can get some sales tax information to you as well, because there are different times the utility has received portions of sales tax. We are not receiving sales tax right now, but we could provide that information.
All right, thank you both so much for being here, and Mr. Quinn as well. We really appreciate it. That brings us to our next meeting date, which is incorrect on this, or has changed since this was printed. We were going to have a finance committee meeting on the Wednesday before our budget retreat, before our board retreat. We are going to combine the AFC and the COW of that week onto that Monday, December 2nd, so we can prep for our board retreat at that meeting. And with that, we are adjourned.